Hi everyone, welcome to this video. So in this video, I'm going to share with you the recipe that I use for making sourdough bread, as well as my take on the explanation of the different steps involved in the whole recipe. So let's dive straight in. So the very first thing when it comes to sourdough making is, first of all, we need to figure out what ingredients we should put in and how much of it. So this brings us to what we call the baker's percentage. You probably hear that quite a bit in certain recipes, but we never really understood why or what's the purpose for. Now this basically helps you to figure out how much you should put of the four main ingredients when it comes to sourdough bread. So the four main ingredients would be flour, water, your sourdough starter, as well as salt. Now these are just the four ingredients you need, and that's it. Sourdough bread actually boils down to really simple ingredients and a lot of just patience and time. So when it comes to flour, that is going to be your 100%. So for example, in this recipe I'm going to share with you, it's going to be 300 grams. You can of course manipulate this number as long as this is your baseline. Then we're going to make today a 75% hydration dough. So water is going to be 75%. So 75% of 300 grams, it will be 225 grams or ml of water. Starter is going to be 20%. So 20% of 300 grams will be 60 grams of starter, and salt will be 2%. So that will give us 6 grams of salt. And this is basically all that we need for our recipe today. Now for flour, I use bread flour, and for water, I use filtered water. My starter is actually really simple, so let's talk a little bit about starters. Let's talk sourdough starter. Now, to create your own sourdough starter is actually really simple. You only need two ingredients, which is basically water and flour. Now, for me, in my purpose, or my experiment, if you would call it, I actually use all-purpose flour, and for water I use filtered water. Now I couldn't have access to rye flour or bread flour, which some people use for their starter, so all-purpose actually worked fine for me. Now for water, you would want to have filtered water. The reason is because the chlorine in water sometimes can prohibit yeast production, and it might even kill off your yeast. So that's why I want to use filtered water. Now if you don't have a filter jug like I do at home, what you can do is you can just have a cup of water, leave it overnight, and when you wake up in the morning to feed your starter, the chlorine should have evaporated. Now, how do you create your starter? So there are, again, ratios. So usually you would hear the 1:2:2 ratio, or 1:3:3 ratio. Now, what this simply means is the amount of starter you have to the amount of water and flour you should feed them. So you can go with either. Now for me, generally, I follow the 1:3:3 because this gives me a stronger starter because you create more yeast with it. So let me explain what this ratio means. On day one, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add 60 grams of flour with 60 grams of water. That's all I did, and I added it into a glass jar. So 60 grams, mixed it up, and I left it overnight, and that's it. Now from day 2 to about day 7, depending on how strong, it can also go up to day 10. What you're going to do is, once you have all this mixture in here, so you have all this mixture of your starter, right? You are actually going to discard it, and you're only going to keep a certain amount. So how much you're going to keep is dependent on you. So that's where I am going to use the ratio. So let me explain. From day 2 onwards, I'm going to keep only 20 grams of starter. So this is why having weighing scale is really useful, but of course if you don't have it, you can eyeball it. Usually you hear recipes where people throw away half, and they just continue 60 grams of flour, 60 grams of water, and then discard half again. But for me, I'm going to follow the ratio. So if I'm going to keep 20 grams of starter, this is where the ratio comes in. So remember, I'm going to follow the 1:3:3. What this means is, if I have 20 grams of starter, I'm going to feed it 60 grams of flour and 60 grams of water. That's it. And I'm going to continue this daily till about day 7. And you want to make sure that your starter is strong enough with sufficient amount of yeast before you actually start baking. So one way for you to test if your starter is strong enough is you can do something called the float test. Now the float test is simple. You're basically going to take a little bit of a starter, put it in a bowl of water, and if your starter actually floats on the surface of the water, it means that it's probably sufficient to help your bread to rise. Now you need to make sure that when you do the float test, you want to make sure that it's when your starter is about double in size, meaning it's the strongest it can be in your jar. So you always want to take a look at your jar, preferably one with a straight edge. And if your original starter was here when you fed it and the next day it became, or not next day, maybe a few hours later, it's here, this is when it's like the peak, right? And that's when you know you're going to use it for your recipe. Now let's dive into the steps that we have to take when it comes to the sourdough bread making. So after you feed your starter, that's the very first thing you need to do. So in the morning, the first thing I do is I feed my starter 60 grams of water, 60 grams of flour, and roughly my starter takes about 5 hours to double in size. Now, just before it completely doubles in size, you're going to move on to the second step, which is autolysing your flour. Now, what this is basically you're just mixing flour and water together, and that's it. Now, what this step does is it wants to make sure that all the flour that you put in is 100% hydrated with water, and it's starting to form the gluten structure before you even put in your starter. Now, autolysing can be about 20 minutes before you add in your starter to about 2 hours. So you can play around with the timing, but usually what I see is if I'm looking at my jar, and if let's say my starter at the beginning was here, and then it's starting to be about here. So it's not doubled yet, it's going to be. That's when I usually would autolyse my flour and water together. Then, when your starter is actually fully doubled, so roughly about here, and there's a lot of bubbles and it's looking really, really strong, then we move on to step number 3. So step number 3 is we're going to add our starter into our flour and water mixture. So following the recipe, I'm going to add 60 grams of starter in, and I'm going to mix it properly using my hands. And after the starter is mixed properly, I'm going to add my salt. And according to the recipe, it's going to be 6 grams of salt. Now, once those are properly mixed in, this is when the bulk fermentation process happens. This is when your dough is forming, all those lovely air bubbles and forming its gluten structure. And the bulk fermentation timing really depends on your environment, how hot it is and how humid it is. So this is where a lot of the recipes online, the timing is a little bit different. And if I followed that to the T, I realize my dough is always over fermented. So for me, my temperature is roughly about, I would say 30 to 34 degrees Celsius. So that's why I have to shorten my timing quite a bit. So after you added the salt, you're going to wait for about 30 minutes I would say about 30 minutes, and you're going to start your first stretch and folds. Now, stretch and folds are really gentle ways of building gluten structure for your dough, and you're basically going to do that for about 4 to 6 times until you feel that your dough is strong enough. So I will show you in a video later of how I do stretch and folds. And after I did the first one, I will cover it up and then I will go back in to about 4 to 6 times. And it's usually of an interval between 20 to 30 minutes. So usually what I'll do is I will go in every 20 minutes after my first stretch and fold to just do it again until I feel that the dough is pretty strong. You should try to do all your stretch and folds within the first 2 hours of your bulk fermentation. After you feel that, your dough is strong enough, you can do the window pane test to see if there's enough gluten structure. And if you're satisfied with that, you're just going to leave it. And what I do is I usually will leave it for about 1 more hour, and that's about it. So for me, my total bulk fermentation time is about 3 hours. After that, I'm going to do my pre-shape. So after my bulk fermentation, I'm going to move on to my pre-shape. So pre-shape is basically just helping the dough get into the shape you want before your final shaping. And this helps to kind of reduce the resistance you're going to face when you're final shaping your dough. So for pre-shape, it's quite simple. You'll see it in the video where you basically put it on the surface, and you're kind of going to shape it into a ball, and you're going to leave it for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then you're going to move on to your final shaping. So the final shape, I again will fold it into by itself and then roll it around the table so that it builds enough tension, and I'll put it into my bowl with a towel. If you have a banneton, this is where you're going to put your dough in, but I don't have one, so I'm improvising, and it's been working for me just fine. Just make sure that you dust your banneton or your tea towel in a bowl with rice flour, because rice flour doesn't have any gluten, so your dough will not stick to it. But of course, if you have no rice flour, any flour should work. Then for the final shaping, after you do that and you put it into your bowl, you're going to let it proof. Now, proofing is basically allowing the dough to, again, grow in size before you pop it into the oven. Now, for proofing, I again realize that for me, I have to shorten the timing compared to what other people have been doing. So for me, usually I will proof for about 1 hour to 1 hour 30 minutes. Now, one way for me to double check is I will use the poke test. So I'll poke my finger into the dough, and I will see if actually the dough rises up quickly, or does it slowly fill in. And then last step will be to bake it. So of course you will have to preheat your oven. You need a really hot oven when it comes to baking bread, especially. So you bake it and then make sure you cool it before you actually slice into it. So those are the steps, and I hope I kind of helped you understand, you know, the main steps when it comes to sourdough. So now I'm going to show you the video of how I did it. So let's begin. The very first step is to get our starter ready, and here you want to have a glass jar that's clean and preferably with straight edge, so you can actually see if your starter has doubled in size or not. And I'm also going to use plain flour and filtered water, and of course my old starter that I have in the fridge because it's been with me for about 1.5 weeks now, 1.5 months. So now I'm going to feed my starter to get it going. So here you see me putting some of my old starter into my glass jar. So I'm using my measuring scale to weigh how much I'm going to put, and I'm going to put 20 grams. And you're actually going to realize in the video that I exceeded and I made it 21 grams. So don't worry too much about it, because if you follow the ratio, everything will work out just fine. So if I follow the 1:3 ratio, 21 grams of starter will give me 63 grams of plain flour and 63 grams of filtered water. So that's what I'm going to do to add into my starter right now, as you can see in the video. And then we're just going to mix it all up and let it sit on the countertop. Just a note, when you're mixing, you want to make sure you mix it really well, because you want the starter to be fully incorporated with the plain flour and the water that you're feeding it. So this is 100% hydrated starter, and we're going to use it the moment it starts to double in size in our recipe. So once you kind of mix your starter, you want to kind of put a rubber band around the jar. So this way it's kind of like a guideline for you to actually see if your starter has doubled in size or not. Of course, you can also use a whiteboard marker to kind of draw a line, but for me the rubber band method seems to work really, really well. In about 4 to 5 hours, I will take a look at my starter, and you can kind of see bubbles are forming on the surface. And if you look at the pictures, right, this one is close to being doubled. And then the next picture, this is when it's doubled and it's ready to use. So you should find the right timing to start autolysing your flour. So here we're autolysing, which is basically a fancy word for mixing water and flour together. Now this way we want to make sure that all the flour that we use will be fully hydrated, and when you kind of mix it together, the dough will actually start forming the gluten structure before you even start applying your starter, or adding your starter, I mean. And this way your dough will be a lot stronger and it will taste a lot better, according to some research that I've done. So here I'm putting in 300 grams of bread flour. You want a high protein flour this way, and I'm going to put in 225 grams of filtered water, which you can see here. And then after that, I'm just going to mix it up really, really well, and you're going to mix it until you see no dry flour anywhere. So that means all the flour has absorbed all the water that you've added add it in, and you're just going to leave it on your counter until your starter has doubled in size. After mixing with a spoon, I generally like to go in with my hands to just really feel the dough. Now this will be very sticky as you can see in the video here, but don't panic. So sometimes I'll use a scraper and kind of like scrape off all the wet bits, but inevitably you're going to get dough stuck onto your fingers, and that's perfectly fine. But you just want to look for something like that where there's no dry patches of flour left anywhere, and that's when you know that you can leave it on the counter to rest. Once your starter has doubled in size, what you can do is you can try the float test. So this helps you to see whether your starter is actually strong enough to help your dough to rise. Now you want a bowl of water and you want to gently put some starter onto the surface of the water, and if it floats, you know that your starter is good to go. Here you just saw me add 60 grams of starter into my dough, and then I'm just going to kind of fold it in, as you can see in the video here, where I just take the sides and kind of fold it into the center. So I want to use my hands because this way I can kind of feel if the starter has been fully incorporated into the dough. Now here your dough would be less sticky because you've given it some time to rest as well. Then I'm going to add in the salt after my starter has been fully incorporated, and I'm going to add in 6 grams of salt. Then I'm going to dimple it in with my fingers as you just saw, and do the same kind of like folding technique to kind of put the flour and the salt together. Now here you can also use the pincer method, as you can see what I'm doing here, where I'm kind of just pressing the dough tightly with my hands, and this way you can kind of feel if there's any like salt granules left in the dough. You don't want any salt to be left there. You want it to be fully dissolved in your dough and water mixture. So that's why we are going to do that. And then once you feel that it's fully incorporated, you're again going to cover it up and leave it on the counter to rest for another 30 minutes before we begin our first stretch and fold. 30 minutes into the bulk fermentation stage, we are going to do some stretch and folds. Now you want all your stretch and folds to be done within about the first 2 hours of your bulk fermentation. Now this means about 4 to 6 times about every 20 to 30 minutes. Here you see me kind of like wetting my hands because it really helps when it comes to working with wet dough, and you're kind of like pulling the edges up and then you're pressing it down and folding it over itself. And then as you keep going along, you turn the bowl sideways so that you get all the edges of the dough. And eventually you're going to get into kind of like a tight ball, as you can see in the video here. And once you feel that, you know, it's pretty much sufficient, roughly about 8 to 10 folds per round, you can cover it up and leave it for another 20 to 30 minutes before you begin again. Now here you actually see that the dough is a lot more elastic, and I can actually go a lot higher with my stretch and folds. So you're going to realize that maybe towards your last 2 or 3 stretch and folds, your dough is a lot more forgiving because you're really building the gluten structure in this step, right? And it's really going to be a lot easier to work with. Always have a bowl of water by the side so you can, you know, make sure that your hands don't stick. To see if your dough needs more stretch and folds, one way you can do it is the window pane test. So here you saw that it broke, so I had to do a few more stretch and folds. And this shows you that it's perfectly good and we can begin. Now, I'm so sorry I forgot to actually film the pre-shape. My camera didn't record, so I'm going to just show you the final shape, which is pretty much the same thing. But here I'm prepping my bowl with my tea towel. If you have a Benetton, you can go ahead and use that. But here I'm just putting some rice flour because rice flour doesn't have gluten, so your dough will not stick to it. And this is the dough that I have pre-shaped, but I'm just going to show you the technique, which is exactly the same as the pre-shape. So here I'm going to use a bit more flour and I'm going to put it on top of the dough, because this way once I flip the dough over, the dough is not going to stick onto my tabletop. Having a dough scraper is also really useful here. So I'm going to use the dough scraper, go underneath the dough and flip it over, because I want the top to still remain the top when I put it into the bowl. Then I'm just going to spread out the edges ever so slightly and gently, and then I'm going to fold it over itself. So I'll do the top and then I'll do the bottom. So kind of like pull it and fold it to the center of the dough. My technique is not that great yet, but it really, helps to give the ball of dough some tension, so when you bake it, it's going to have that beautiful kind of like crack. And you're also going to do the other sides. So after you fold it, you want to take your dough scraper and kind of flip it around again. And now we're kind of going to shape it into a ball to give it more tension on the surface. So sometimes if it's so sticky, I'm going to use my dough scraper first, and then once I feel like it's more less sticky, I'm going to go with my hands. And here I don't want my surface to be floured because I want the dough to kind of stick to the surface, and this way it builds tension. And you can kind of see that my dough now is a lot tighter and the ball is a lot smaller. Then I'm going to flip it into my bowl with my tea towel, and if you see any like creases or holes in the dough, you kind of want to pinch it. Then I'm just adding more rice flour at the top so that the towel doesn't stick to my dough. And then I'm going to cover it up and let it proof for about 1 hour to 1.5 hours. So I want to show you the poke test. This test was done right after I added it into the bowl, and you can see the dough is bouncing back really, really fast. This means it's not ready to go into the oven. This is when it was about 40 minutes, and I just want to show you the poke test one more time. So if you see me putting my finger in there, the dough still bounces up pretty quickly, so I wanted to give it a bit more time to proof before I put it in. And this was the final test. You can see that the dough actually rises back slowly and holds the indentation. So that's how I know that the dough is ready to be baked. Now, the oven has been preheated to 250 degrees. So roughly do that about 30 minutes until you feel that your dough is ready to bake. And then I'm going to transfer my dough onto a baking sheet, as you can see here. And then I'm going to use this ceramic pot with a cover. Now, a lot of recipes involve Dutch ovens, which I do not have, but having some form of container will help to contain the heat and the steam. Then I just kind of like cut a line across my bread. Now, this is actually called scoring your bread. I just used a really sharp blade, and this way your bread kind of knows where to break. If you don't cut it, what's going to happen is it will just break at the weakest spot. So I put it into my ceramic pot, and I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of water, as you can see in the video, like around here. Now, why I'm going to sprinkle water is because I want it to steam even more. After that, I'm going to cover the lid and I'm going to pop it into the oven. So my oven has been preheated for 250 degrees, and now I'm going to pop the ceramic pot in with the cover on it, and I'm going to bake it for 30 minutes. And then after 30 minutes is up, I'm going to take out the cover and let it bake for another 15 minutes until it's golden brown. So depending on your oven, you measure the time accordingly. And then after it's done, please let it cool down completely. So I just like to put it on the steaming rack that I have here. But when you actually let your bread cool completely, it kind of retains more of the moisture and the flavor, and it won't be gummy when you cut it. So usually I would let it rest for about 2 to 3 hours before I actually cut into it. And here you can see me cutting into it. So now it's a bit late at night, so you can see the lighting has changed. And after you cut into it, you can kind of see that it has really nice like air bubbles formed. And this is the recipe that I found worked for me after trying many different recipes online, and the timing for the fermentation and proofing. So I hope the recipe helped you in some way, and I hope that you try this out and let me know how it works for you. So just remember to tailor the timing according to your environment. Thank you very much for watching.